What if the 1920 U.S. presidential election went differently? What if, instead of Warren G. Harding, the presidency was claimed by James M. Cox, a newspaper publisher, reform-minded governor, and champion of the League of Nations? Imagine a 1920s America steered not by a call for normalcy, but by a push for global engagement and progressive reform. Would the roaring 20s still roar? Or would the entire decade look and feel completely different? Like and subscribe for more. Also, don't forget to hit that notification bell for more history documentaries. Please watch the video till the end, as good interaction would help the performance of the video and the growth of my channel massively. How Cox won, changing the 1920 election outcome. To imagine a Cox victory in 1920, we need to adjust a few key variables. The real election was a Republican landslide, with Harding winning over 60% of the vote. But in this alternate timeline, we assume that President Woodrow Wilson, though deeply unpopular by 1920, either steps aside earlier or declines to push the League of Nations as a central issue. In turn, Cox distances himself from Wilson's baggage and campaigns more on domestic reform and rebuilding after World War I. Support from newly enfranchised women voters, a more energized urban progressive base, and better turnout among African American voters in the North, still loyal to the party of Lincoln, but uneasy with Harding's vagueness on civil rights, help Cox carry key swing states like Ohio, New York, and Illinois. Initial reaction: a divided public, a nervous establishment. Cox's victory would shock the Republican establishment and please the fading remnants of Wilson's progressive coalition. In the North, reactions would be mixed. Many industrialists feared more regulation, while urban reformers welcomed the continuity of progressive-era ideals. In the Bible Belt and rural Midwest, however, voters who craved Harding's return to normalcy would see Cox as an extension of wartime government overreach. Former President Wilson, despite poor health, would likely take credit for the win, hoping that Cox would carry on his internationalist legacy. The Cox Presidency, an agenda for reform. Cabinet and leadership style. Cox, a practical progressive, would likely choose a cabinet of technocrats and reformers. Franklin D. Roosevelt, his 1920 running mate, would rise in prominence, potentially as Secretary of the Navy or Secretary of Labor, giving FDR early executive experience. Domestic agenda. Cox would focus on rebuilding the economy post-World War I, likely favoring moderate regulation, investment in infrastructure, and progressive labor reforms. He'd support organized labor more than Harding did, possibly defusing some of the labor unrest of the early 20s through compromise rather than crackdown. Foreign policy. Cox would push hard for U.S. participation in the League of Nations, leading to a tense battle in the Senate. With stronger Democratic backing, and perhaps some concessions, the U.S. might join in some advisory or partial role, changing America's isolationist trajectory. Return to normalcy? Not quite. Without Harding's laissez-faire approach, there'd be no famous return to normalcy. Instead, Cox would frame the 1920s as a new era of American leadership abroad and progressive responsibility at home. Government would remain more active in the economy, though still shy of full New Deal-style intervention. The Washington Naval Conference would still happen, but under Cox, the U.S. might adopt a more idealistic stance, using it to push not just arms limits, but also stronger international cooperation. The Teapot Dome scandal, avoided. The infamous Teapot Dome scandal, a result of corrupt dealings under Harding's Secretary of the Interior, Albert Fall, would almost certainly not occur under Cox. Cox's administration, likely filled with reformers and watchdogs, would avoid the massive corruption that plagued Harding's term. economic policy. Less laissez-faire, more stability? The Ford-Macumber Tariff of 1922, which raised import taxes and worsened international trade tensions, may be replaced by a more moderate version under Cox. He was no radical free trader, but likely would not have raised tariffs so aggressively. Similarly, the Immigration Act of 1924, which sharply limited immigration from non-Northern European countries, would face heavy resistance under Cox. As a Democrat with support from urban immigrant communities, Cox might advocate for more inclusive policies, potentially delaying or softening the act. Taxes, the economy, and the Roaring Twenties. Harding and Coolidge lowered taxes drastically, fueling the investment boom of the 1920s. Cox, favoring fiscal responsibility but also public investment, might maintain moderate taxation. This could mean a slower, more controlled economic boom, but possibly also a less severe crash by the decade's end. The Roaring Twenties would still happen. Jazz, cinema, and consumer culture were larger than politics, but it might be less explosive under Cox's more cautious economic stewardship. Civil rights, the Klan, and the Harlem Renaissance. The Ku Klux Klan, which resurged in the 1920s, would remain a significant force, especially in the Democratic South. Cox, though not a staunch civil rights advocate, was not as openly appeasing of the Klan as many Southern Democrats. He might denounce Klan violence, but avoid full confrontation, balancing Northern and Southern party factions. The Harlem Renaissance would still flourish, driven by Black creativity, migration, and urbanization, though Cox might support more federal recognition of Black artists and intellectuals than Harding did. Prohibition, a delicate balance. As a moderate, Cox would likely enforce prohibition, but not with zeal. He'd probably take a more pragmatic approach, focusing on public health and crime control rather than moral crusades. This could lead to less violent enforcement and perhaps earlier calls for repeal from within his party. The 1924 election. Would Cox win again? By 1924, if Cox's presidency is stable and scandal-free, he'd likely face a Republican like Calvin Coolidge, who appeals to business interests and conservatives. The election would be close, but if the economy is stable and Cox has avoided major missteps, he could win a second term, especially with FDR helping rally progressives and immigrants. Cox's second term and his legacy. In a second term, Cox would likely expand infrastructure, support union rights, and further integrate the U.S. into global diplomacy. His cautious progressivism might delay the more radical policy shifts of the 1930s, and without a full laissez-faire 1920s, the Great Depression might hit later or differently. Cox would be remembered as a bridge between Wilsonian idealism and New Deal reform, a what-if president who brought the U.S. onto the world stage just a bit earlier and avoided some of Harding's darkest scandals. Conclusion: James M. Cox's victory in 1920 could have changed everything, from foreign policy to economic boom, to civil rights and the culture of the Jazz Age. A less corrupt, more internationalist America might have emerged earlier. But would a slower Roaring Twenties and delayed deregulation have changed the course of the 20th century? What do you think? Write your opinion and version of the story in the comments below. Please be polite and kind. If you want to know what would have happened if Dukakis defeated Bush in 1988, click on the video on the left. Thanks for watching.